Um, okay, someone just started recording. Fantastic. And so today's panel is going to be focused on policy and strategy, which is quite an exciting conversation, but sometimes policy and strategy can be a bit high level, lofty conversations for most of us RSEs who are more of like doers and we just want to get things done and get our hands dirty. But these are just really valuable and important conversations that we need to have in order to achieve our goals going forward. And I'm really excited to have some really amazing community leaders today who will be our panelists. And so I'm just going to do a quick round. And so maybe you can introduce yourself and talk to us about your connection to the RSE community or your interest in the RSE community a little bit. Manodeep, you're first on my screen. Do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm a computational astronomer. I'm based out of Swinburne. I have like the typical RSE role that, well, I do the typical RSE jobs that you can imagine. In this context, I'm also the Australian chair of RSE-AUNZ. So Nooriyah and I, we work closely together. So happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Manodeep. We're really excited to hear your views. Saranjeet, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Nooriyah. I'm Saranjeet. I have a background in statistics. Early this year, I started as a part-time community manager for Research Software Alliance, primarily focusing on the Asia region. I am also the co-founder of the RSE Asia Association and also a fellow of the Software Sustainability Institute. Yeah, that's
fantastic.
Me.
Lots of hats, which is really great. Why do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Leong from Malaysia. I'm the Vice President of External Relations of International Network of Women Engineers and Scientists. Basically, we are dealing with a lot of women in STEM activities. Of course, I'm also with the World Federations of Engineering Organization, and I'm also with the Institutions of Engineers Malaysia. Basically, we deal with a lot of policy and strategy. I'm an electronic engineer, so I'm very familiar with software engineering as well. So I wish to learn from everybody, and we should have a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Y. Melanie, do you want to?
Sure. So I'm Melanie Johnston-Hollit. I am a radio astronomer by background, so I'm a professor of radio astronomy. I come into this space with a long history of working on the design and construction of radio telescopes, international scale radio telescopes, including the software processing and high performance computing needs for the Square Kilometre Array, which I spent 20 years working on at the level of the board for 7. Sorry, I was on the board for 7. After moving out of directing radio telescopes, I became the director of the Curtin Institute for Data Science, which is Australia's largest university-based data science institute. We have 50 in-house technical staff who work on a range of different things from data science through to research software engineering. And so what I've been doing in the last few years as director of that institute, in addition to growing the institute, is looking at the career paths for people who straddle this space between providing that sort of technical competency and overview either in data science or research software, and meeting the demands of the academic process. And so I am at the coalface of how these two worlds don't connect particularly well. And we've developed a particular model to solve that and have career progression inside our institute. So that's how I come to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. We'd love to hear more about your experience with that. So I'll kick things off with just when we talk about policy and strategy. I guess in this session, we've sort of put both of these things together, but I would love to see whether we can draw a distinction between policy and strategy when we consider these two aspects. So when you think about impact, how do you think policy and strategy differ? And could you give us an example of some of the positive things that have happened in the RSE space or in RSE adjacent space that you've seen in terms of policy or strategy that really stuck with you? Does anyone want to go first? I don't want to voluntold you.
I can go first.
Okay.
So to be brutally honest, I haven't actually seen a lot of policy and strategy that's been applied here. But what I do see is that there is a grassroots and growing recognition of exactly this problem, of the fact that you have creation of a class of essentially new workers to, take scientific research in a direction that needs to go in the big data era, but that the recognition of what that class of people are and what their career progression is hasn't yet been well defined. And it kind of reminds me of the situation that we had with electronic engineering coming out of physics in the 1930s through 50s. And so you've got people who straddle this line uncomfortably at the moment, but conversations like this are happening to say, okay, well, how do we actually make this a standardized career? What does it look like? And how does it support and be recognized? And so I don't see it implemented at the strategic or policy level particularly often, but it's fantastic that the conversation is happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Saranjeet.
So I just wanted to add to that point, which Melanie said about recognition. So because this is kind of a culture change, it's really slow, but there is increased recognition happening around. For example, the US RSE recently got a fund from the Alfred Sloan Foundation. And it's a huge fund which could sustain them for a few years. There are also different universities, especially in the UK, adopting and creating these centralized or embedded RSE teams. So I think in the positive terms, there is definitely the recognition is increasing. And whenever I have this conversation with the Asian community, they're quite excited to learn about this new role. So I don't see very strong strategy or policy happening within Asia, but at least people are starting to have awareness. So that's a positive change, at least for me.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
a really
yeah.
good point. Go ahead, Wai.
Yeah. Okay, I would like to share some humble view. Because of the ChatGPT, there are some discussion on the policy, and especially for ChatGPT in educations, in writing, publications, there are strong discussions. I think we can see a lot of strategy and policy being suggested by the government, Ministry of Educations, researchers, and publishers as well. This is a good sign. Maybe the rest of you can comment on this. Thank you.
Like I'm gonna just so for me, like policy and strategy are slightly distinct in terms of just if you take the word of what it is doing. Like policy can be at a different levels of what it's policy is sort of more typically policy is more hard, like sort of boundaries of what you can or cannot do, or what is encouraged or discouraged essentially. But that still leaves quite a bit of space of what things, right? Like within any subgroup, as humans, we tend to organize in subgroups. So within any subgroup, you might have a particular outcome that you want to get to, right? So for example, outcome for RSEs might be that we want more stable careers, right? Something to that effect. And so how do you get that outcome, to me, is more on the strategy side. Here's a sort of the strategy we're adopting to make the steps for us to get to that desired outcome. Like, for example, for us, when Roland, who led the RSE-AUNZ strategy document, and it's a fantastic document. If you haven't read it, I would encourage everyone to read it. It's in terms of So as the steering committee of RSE-AUNZ, as you can see, just based on the discussions over the past 2 days, there's a wide variety of things that we are interested in. We want to make progress, right? But as the committee, our total effort is limited in what we can meaningfully pursue. So with the strategy that Roland sort of put out was very useful because it sort of framed the things we value, and how we make our decision on what to go for, or where to put our energy. That's how I see it. I'm not sure if that's the formal way of defining, but based on the others, I haven't seen any policy come out yet. I've seen recommendations come out that impact on RSE space, like the UNESCO recommendations and the OECD recommendations, and all of these recommendations have come out, supporting, which are more on the open sciencey side, open science, open data side. But that's, at least in my head, and I keep saying, those things are related. Because if you leave an untrained researcher, they are not going to get you towards open science. It's unlikely. So these are the bits I see it. Yeah, so that's how I see policy and strategy.
Yeah, that's such a valuable point there, Manodeep, because when you think about policy, it helps us to regulate the use of research software, for example. And so it states quite clearly in detail on how you would sort of create some regulations around research software. But then when you think of strategy, for example, the strategy document that RSE-AUNZ has developed, and this was more around achieving our goals for the community. Melanie, you unmuted.
Yeah, I had a further point, which is that, look, policy is really about where you've got an organisational boundary that has the capacity to enforce something, a set of rules, a set of behaviours, that they'll create policy to do that. So when you're looking at a grassroots organisation or a community-wide organisation like this, you can set policies for your members in the interactions that they have inside of your organisation, but you can't set a broad framing policy. You're never going to see a policy for this. What you are going to see is, as Manodeep says, recommendations. So you're going to see best practice recommendations that are going to come out, and then hopefully individual organisations like universities or government departments or whatever will look at those and say, okay, we will set a framework, a policy framework inside our organisation to be able to respond to those recommendations. So, so strategy is about those high-level goals. How do you achieve them, etc. Policy is really that mid-level management. What do we do to make it actually work inside our organisation? And so looking for a universal policy in this space, you won't get to that. But you will hopefully get to sort of a standardization of approach and thought and, what good citizenship is. In the same way that things like the Vancouver Protocol that came out years ago talks about authorship on publications. So what do you need to be justifiably an author on a publication? That came out of a protocol, which then was adopted by universities that then put it into their policy. So hopefully you can have that same pathway.
Why you have your hand up?
Okay, I would like to share my humble view on this policy thing. Basically, what we all encountered for the RSE policy is focusing on the software quality, licensing, security, and compliance. The scope more on whether the software is handled in research. They can cover the aspect like open source licensing, data management, cybersecurity, and ethic considerations. Okay. Basically, the RSE policy is to ensure that the research software is developed and used in a way that promotes transparency, reproducibility, reliability in a project. This is my humble view. And there are also some humble standards and expectations for software practices.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there are two really different aspects when you think about policy and strategy, which I guess we've come to from this discussion. So maybe we dive a little bit deeper into strategy, which, and when we think about the RSE strategy that I've just linked in the chat for everybody, we really we found it quite challenging to strike a balance between prioritizing goals and prioritizing goals that met a certain selection criteria, right? So you want to be able to achieve every goal that you set out to achieve, but there's always that challenge between when does a goal become too aspirational and when is a goal achievable. And so I'd love to hear from you on, when you think about strategy, what are your top tips on striking that balance between aspirational versus achievable goals so that we can maximize the impact of strategy?
I'll jump in again. I never set goals I don't think I could achieve. So, you know, my view is to understand what it is I have control over, what it is that I have influence over. So who can I influence to get where I want to go? What's a realistic estimation of those things? And then what goals can be achieved from that? I would not set personally goals which I did not personally believe could be achieved. So that's how I approach stuff. Having said that, I am very ambitious. So I set quite high, you know, goals that other people think, oh my God, you won't be able to do that. But I never set anything I don't personally believe in, because I think that takes you down a path of investing effort somewhere where you're just not going to get traction. So that's a somewhat controversial take on the topic. So I'll leave that there for other people to jump in and comment, but that's how I approach it.
I would say that involving the stakeholders, whoever they are, the funders, the researchers, in the goal-making process or the goal-setting process from the very start would be helpful, because we can then come up with more realistic goals, and we would disappoint even lesser people. Like, these are the people who would be disappointed if we don't achieve our goals. So involving these people from the start, communicating as early as possible, and then having those transparent and open communications about what we expect to achieve would make a lot of difference, is what I feel.
Yeah, both really interesting views. Melanie, I just want to go back to your point around, you believe that you'll be able to achieve the goals before you set the goal, and I think that's a really interesting way to look at this, because even though you have aspirational goals somewhere where no one can, like, you know, people might think they're too aspirational. If you believe you can do it, then yep, that's a good goal. So that's not controversial. I'm in support of that idea. I like that. Anyone else want to go next?
But I can.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure, right? Like, I don't think I have quite found out yet. So I tend to have ambitious goals. So but I'm also, so it's like a balance, but this works for me personally in terms, and right now I'm talking about just me setting my goals, right? Because it's slightly different when it's the RSE-AUNZ community goals, because there, I think, as the community, so let me talk about the community goals. That's the content for the community, because I see us as within the steering committee, as we are sort of the stakeholders, or the sort of, we are shepherding our community along in some ways, right? And if anyone who's listening, we are like, please join us. Like, we are always looking for members of the steering committee. The more diverse set of views we have, the better it is, and that makes us stronger. So in terms of moving the community forward, I think we sort of have to push, and having some amount of aspirational goals is essential, with the acknowledgement that we will not get there. It's okay, we will not get there. But if we don't push and say, this is what we would like, would get even far less. So for me, like, And that's why it comes back down, the way we did the strategies, it comes back down to what's important. What do we value, right? And so if the things we value that tell us that, okay, here are the things that would be really nice to have. There are some ones that obviously it's never going to happen because just reality. So, but without having some amount of aspirational goals for the community, I think we would not make as much progress. So having aspirational goals is good for progress for the community members, essentially.
Who are also our stakeholders. And as
Yeah, of course.
Saranjeet mentioned, that, you know, if we co-design with our stakeholders and involve them as early as possible, then perhaps that's a good way to go, to strike that balance.
Yep.
Any other views, thoughts? All right. So when we think about developing strategy in the research software space, it's challenging because the value and contributions of RSEs are perhaps identified and seen by line managers or individual labs within which RSEs are embedded. And they're not really necessarily brought to light at an institutional or a government level. I think we touched upon this slightly early on, where we haven't seen any particular policies when it comes to research software or research software engineers at the institutional or government levels at the moment, and everything's very grassroots. But we have seen lots of articles, lots of acknowledgements, and we have statistics like, you know, 90% of publications, scientific publications in the UK recognize research software as an integral part of it, right? They acknowledge research software, and 95% in the US. So what when you think about all of these contributions and it being recognized at that level, this is actually sometimes slowing down the policy changes, right? Because the institutional and governments are still not being able to, it's not as visible to them. So how can individuals not on senior leadership teams or people who are not necessarily making policy, how do we influence policymakers to benefit the community?
Can I go first?
Sure, please.
I would speak from my experience. Like when I was a student, I was of course not, I'm not as senior as the people on this panel are. So when I was a student, what really helped me was being part of the existing communities, because that was one place where my voice was being heard, even if I'm not in a leadership role. So this is what I would suggest if someone is not in a leadership role or not in a position where they make policies or strategies, being part of the strong networks that communities provide and taking benefit of that platform to provide your voice, share your thoughts would make a difference. And I think that globally there has been a shift towards being open, towards open science, towards transparency. It's being observed in many parts of the globe. The UNESCO recommendations, NASA recognizing this the year of open science. So there are communities, there are people who are speaking about it. So getting involved in those spaces, and of course, not burning out yourself by doing too many volunteer activities, is one way that you can make your voice heard, even if you're not in a position, so-called position of power. So yeah, I would strongly suggest being part of communities and engaging with them could help.
Absolutely, communities can be really powerful. Anyone else?
I have two takes on this. So I'd like to come back to a point about centralisation that was raised earlier. So The institute that I run is a central service that runs across the entirety of the university that we sit in, but we also serve government and industry. And what we have advocated is a model where you don't have individual research software engineers in teams being expected to carry the burden of every piece of software knowledge or requirement that say a health science team would want to do, but rather we have a pool of technical people who are peer supported, who have the capacity to go out and work with a particular research team on a fractional FTE if required, or full FTE for a time period, and then come back. And this consolidation of both data scientists and research software engineers has allowed me to prosecute a discussion with the university's human resources about career progression, which is not possible if you're dealing with individual cases which are seen as edge cases, sitting in separate teams across an institution or a government department. But when you collate those people together and show this is really a cohort, so you have to pay attention, you can actually then progress change. So, and it was still a fight, I'll have to say. So when I came into the role, the university that I worked to had 2 levels of data science positions and 1 level of research software developers, which was wildly unsuitable. So in the first year, it took me a year to establish that we could actually have progression for the data science team. So we've now got 4 levels of data scientists, which are tracked to PDs that sit inside the system, and standardized responsibilities and levels of experience. And then in the second year, I worked on the research software developers / engineers. And we now have not 4 levels, but 3 for that. And I think it's that critical mass which is required, but I think also arguing that this is now a type of worker which is unique, that there's a cohort of these people. You know, with data science as a sort of a parallel, everyone's heard of data scientists, right? So but the term data science only came into the lexicon about a decade ago. It was only last year that the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which, you know, classifies different careers and so forth, recognized data science as a particular field in and of itself. And I went and had a look this morning. So the codes that we use for classifications of work across Australia and New Zealand, research software engineer doesn't exist. Research, you know, software developer doesn't exist. So you're still behind in that sort of space there. But I do think that as individuals in a grassroots movement, you can make these discussions and these examples visible to other people. You can say, hey, actually, do we really want to have people working alone as the only sort of software responsible person in a team of psychologists, which is incredibly stressful? Or should we centralize, as, you know, these following examples have demonstrated to be successful? So I think there's 2 aspects to that. As I said, we're in this sort of uncomfortable space that we had with electronic engineering and physics between 1930 and 1950, right? Same sort of thing. You had people who had been trained as physicists, but were instrumental in the creation of electrical engineering and sort of slowly migrated. But when I went to university in the 90s, you know, some of my professors were still building electronics themselves as physicists in their 60s and 70s because they had been split in this thing. But now you would never get a physicist to build you an integrated circuit board, right? You would just not do it. You would absolutely recognize that you want to get an electrical engineer to be able to do that sort of stuff. And I think this is the future of the field. I think that RSE is going to become a specialist discipline, and you're not going to be tied to a particular scientific vertical, but you're going to, you know, be broader than that. And so talking about that future and how do you then prepare from a sort of an institutional or government policy perspective gives you a framework, and it gives people a vision. So that's my experience and take on that.
There's been a unique challenge, I guess, with research software engineering, and I'd love to hear your view on this, where we have people who are sort of experts in certain, in applying software in certain domains. So I'll give you an example of bioinformatics, because that's my background. And when I started to study bioinformatics, it wasn't even a real thing at my university yet. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is when you brought together these people and centralized data science and research software engineering services, was that a particular challenge? Did you have to sort of get RSEs in certain domains, or how did you get people to identify with the word RSE? Because that's really hard.
Not especially. So the staff that I have either have masters or PhDs, the whole lot of them. They come from a very broad range of backgrounds. So one of them's got a PhD in veterinary science, but had, started to work on the data aspects around ecology and around health science, and so had naturally transitioned into a data science role in that case. Others of them have had their software training through a particular lens. Astrophysics is a really obvious one, but have discovered in working for us that actually we'll just take them and put them on a project in health science, and they'll suddenly realize that they can do it, that the skills that you learn are generically applicable. So, I've got one RSE who had come through astronomy and is now building a chatbot for mental health with a team of psychologists. And all of the skills that he had learnt in software development, and really professional software development, I'm talking about making sure you do unit testing and that you've got, standardized fair principles for your software, that it's discoverable, that it's got documentation, that all of these things are generically applicable. So even if you've come through a particular vertical, so research vertical, I work with industry, so sorry for that, domain, the skills are applicable elsewhere. And if you have interest in moving into other places, you can. We do have particular cases where the sort of the complexity of the knowledge in the domain is such that you need a translation piece, that you can't just dump a generalist into that mix. And so that's what we use the breadth of the team for. So if I have someone who want to do a large language model in, say, I don't know, health sciences or humanities, I would bring someone in who was a large language model specialist. If I was looking at a radio astronomy project, which I'm a domain expert in, I would do that translation piece between what the astronomers are trying to do and what the requirements are, so that then you can hand it over to a research software engineer. What you don't want, and Manodeep, apologies for this, but we need to move away from astronomers writing code that you want to deploy on high performance architecture if they're not qualified to do it. So you would be qualified to do it, but most astronomers, as you know, and domain sort of specialists can do proof of concept code, but they can't do that really important parallelization, efficiency, and so forth. And so that's where you do need a translation piece. But otherwise, no, it wasn't really a big challenge at all.
Yeah, cool. That's a really interesting perspective, because, yeah, people from the biological sciences background trying to write software, we literally just patch things together.
Yeah, you don't want to do that, though, right?
Yeah, we don't want to do that.
No.
You do want to have better standards for software. You want to be able to maintain it and reuse it. But I guess that's the challenge there, isn't it?
Yeah, but it also gives you an opportunity to go back to the people who are funding this and say, look, you don't want to do this in the way that you've done it before, because what you'll get is something that once that particular individual goes, you won't be able to run it. You'll have legacy code, which is awful. You need to recognize that this is a pathway now. You need to keep your research software up to date and running and functioning for you to continue to build on it. So the argument that we always have with people who still want to hire, a fractional FTE inside their team is, we can do a better job for you if you do it this way. And what we've found is when we run these projects and they're far more successful and the researcher gets out way better software than they thought they were going to get, then they're believers and then they're on board and then they say, yep, absolutely, this is the way. Or we've had cases where, you've got someone who's an expert in epidemiology trying to manage a research software engineer. Well, an epidemiologist doesn't know anything about the career paths or the challenges or the training. And so you have these very fractious relationships, and we come in and we just say, look, you don't want to do that. Let us give you one of the people. We manage them. You're managed by peers. You're in a peer environment. You've got people who can actually speak to and understand what you're talking about in terms of career challenges and give you decent advice. and you take that away from an academic from a completely different field who really can't help you. And so a lot of my team have come back and said, actually, this is much better because now I don't feel lost. I feel like, you know, I can do the work that I am good at. I can contribute to science and research, but I'm not stuck in a place where nobody understands me. And it's a win-win, it really is. And so then from that grassroots perspective, every time we win, we convert someone at a senior level, and then that makes that conversation easier and advances the field. So I think that's the incremental way to do it.
Cool. Thanks, Melanie. Why did you have any?
Yeah.
thoughts?
So I believe we all can play a very significant effort to promote the RSE policy and strategy. For instance, through the media and then Facebook. And I think just now I'm really impressed with the suggestions of the form of maybe consortium or small group. We need the voices. My experience is we have this multimedia committee in our country. So it's really govern all this policy and strategy. I really hope that we can play a significant role. I believe RSE is very important in the future. We can foresee the future of RSE, and let's speak up. And thanks for the platform here that you all have done a very good job, and this is a good start, and we should continue doing this. Thank you.
Thanks, Wai. Yep, absolutely. I think we still need to have lots more conversations like this, and this is a good start to actually talk about it and demonstrate the value that RSEs provide.
I was going to add something.
Sure.
Just going back, one of the things I have found is like this fantastic, like we as a community, we have a voice. As there are smaller groups happening, RSE groups that may span out, that helps progress the case. But as an individual, I think one of the things you can do to influence policy is, if forget anything else, there's a lot of people don't know about the RSE term, right? Like talk to people, like say, hey, look, this is thing. There's this thing called, there are these kind of people that know a lot about software engineering, and there's a lot about. So, and that would help your case. There'll be research. One of the notes I have taken is like, I might just have a chat with people, like, and it has happened where it's like, I'll have a talk to them for like 10-15 minutes, and their runtime will improve like 500 times, because it's like, no, this is not how you can do it. So which sort of builds up the perception, the positive correlation with, oh, this role is helpful. The other thing that might be helpful, might be specific, is see at least at universities, and here I'm giving my biased sampling of Australia. So the research services people might actually be interested and might be on board. The two sets of people that we don't necessarily think, librarians and research services, people in these areas might be interested and might be very helpful and trying to move forward the case. You may not be on the policy team or people, but they likely have the ears. So if you can convince folks in the research services sector or the librarian sector, that can help further the case.
Strongly agree. At Curtin, one of the first interactions I had was with the library team, who were asking me about, you know, could they help me establish a pool of research software developers / engineers, and they actually went out and did a survey across all of the university and asked people, you know, what fractional use are you making, and do you need? And they did it all for me. They were incredibly helpful. And they came back and they said, look, there's evidence that you need, you know, sort of 3 to 4 FTE across the university. And they then went to the DVCR and said, hey, will you fund this? DVCR said no. But so, you know, they do have some influence. But they were supportive, and I think that is an excellent suggestion. So 100% agree with that.
Cool. And so just a follow-up question for you, Manodeep. So with your one-on-one positive interaction, great idea. Absolutely agree. We can definitely have more conversations, and the more positive impact we can have, the better. But I wonder, how do you make that sort of visible, if you know what I mean? Like, how do you build?
I don't know that
Yeah.
yet, right? Like I have pointed it out, like, hey, look, this is a good thing, but like,
Yeah.
it's as an example, but or how to scale it, right? That's still
Yeah.
a one-on-one interaction, and usually it's serendipitous. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, but we humans find it very convincing. That's right. So if you were ever going to, so like from my perspective, if I was ever going to try sort of advocate for having a RSE role, right, for someone, they say, hey, we need this role, and then I would just go, hey, look, in RSE, this is random person, Manodeep, that RSE, 15 minutes of their time improved someone else's workflow by, I don't know, 100 times faster. So how much is that value? What value is that to you? And so
Yeah.
at least that gives me somewhere to start off, right? So
Yeah, that's definitely a great starting point. Absolutely. We're all trying to make a positive impact in research. And yep, I guess it's just that challenge of measuring, you know, just value and impact. We have a few questions popping in from the people listening here. So maybe I think Melanie's already addressing them in the chat, which is great. Paul, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so I'm sorry for jumping in late here, because I didn't take the day off, so I've actually been trying to double up. So, and this probably has already been covered, but what importance is there, you know, in the research landscape for having RSIs, and, you know, in terms of like research software infrastructure, like specifically organizations whose job it is to actually, you know, the actual care and feeding of research software engineers as a resource, as opposed to you know, dispersing them out amongst individual researchers and so forth. Is that something that you know, is worth fostering, investigating? You know, where are we at with that sort of a notion? And the reason I'm asking is because that's exactly what I am. I'm a research software engineer within Access NRI, which is an infrastructure for research software engineers to offer services to a particular area of research.
So I might respond to that. So hi, I'm Melanie. I'm the director of the Curtin Institute for Data Science. So we run exactly that. So I have a team of 50 technical staff that sit inside a research institute, and we go out and provide software and data science capability to other parts of Curtin University, but also to government and industry. And I was just mentioning previously, there are some good reasons for that from the career perspectives of research software engineers. So you're line managed by someone who understands what it is that you're doing, has a technical background, rather than being line managed by a researcher in a completely different field who may or may not understand the challenges and opportunities in the field. It also allows for peer-to-peer learning. It allows for support models for addressing difficult questions. It takes pressure off individual research software engineers who can often be put into a research lab as the only technical person there, and then be expected to understand every possible solution to questions that researchers have. So I do think that this is an effective model. It's certainly been a very effective model for me in building up a team. So I started with 8 3 years ago, and as I said, now I've got 50. So yeah, it's been really successful. It's complicated to run. Somebody asked me about how it's funded in the chat, and it's complicated. It's funded from fractional FTEs from various different sources. I run the most complicated business unit inside the university, but it is worthwhile and it is very successful. So I think that is certainly something to look at going forward.
Yeah, I think Access NRI is in a invidious position. It's enviable position is probably a better way of putting it, in that it's a national research infrastructure, funded through NCRIS.
Yep. Yeah, so NCRIS are interested in funding various types of this. So we have through NCRIS something called ADAX, which is the Astronomy Data and Compute Service, which is actually a group of research software engineers distributed at Swinburne and Curtin and Macquarie, who actually provide research software support to the astronomy community. So it comes out of NCRIS funding, which is allocated in the astronomy bucket through AAL. And my team supply that at Curtin. So we fractionally deploy people who sit inside my institute to that process. And NCRIS is certainly interested in that as a more general model. So yeah.
Yeah, so the upshot of that is that NCRIS knows what a research software engineer is and has some idea of what the career structure should be.
They do. And one of the other important things that's happened most recently is that, the government has previously been focused on providing hardware infrastructure for compute. So a lot of the last sort of 5 years worth of discussions around where the government should invest has been on that hardware side. Every time they send a consultant out to speak to me, I say, well, there's no point investing only in the hardware if you don't actually populate the ecosystem with people who can make use of it and make use of it at a, highly strategic, properly documented, efficient level. And researchers are not those people, but research software engineers and HPC specialists are. And so if you're going to fund the hardware, you also have to fund the people component as well. And I'm pleased to say that in the most recent report that was done for NCRIS earlier this year, that was actually included. So yes, there is this recognition that the hardware and the capacity to use the hardware are part of the same equation. It's not just build a supercomputer and that will come.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's the good evolution that has happened, where people are now also considered part of the infrastructure, whereas infrastructure previously was like, oh, here's get some tons of CPUs, whatever hardware, but it's people as infrastructure is in motion, so it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. So just in that entire conversation, it was very Australia focused. Could someone tell me what NCRIS is?
Sorry.
So for those of us not in Australia.
Yeah. So NCRIS is the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Fund. So basically, it's a pot of money that the Australian government makes available to support ongoing facilities that are sort of critically important. And there's a number of facilities in Australia that have been designated an NCRIS facility. So for example, the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre and is partly funded through this NCRIS bucket. So in New Zealand, because I was in New Zealand for 9 years, you don't have quite the same sort of mechanisms, but NeSI obviously is that sort of national level infrastructure process. So when NeSI gets renewed out of vote science, it's that same sort of thing, but at a smaller scale.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. That was useful. We have Philip raising his hand. Did you have a question?
Yeah, look, I just wanted to, well, first of all, I guess to thank people for raising many of the issues that we need to resolve in the RSE space, building a sense of community, having appropriate supervision, giving staff the opportunity to broaden out their view rather than being just within one group. I also wanted to say that Melanie's centralised model, I mean, I think that obviously works for her institution. I'm from Melbourne University, and we're a very large institution. I did a survey last year that suggests we have about 300 staff with a substantial role in developing bespoke software for research. And we have, well, our biggest sort of individual group is probably about 50 technical staff. And if I use the word service, people will stare at me in horror and run away very fast. So centralising in our context would not work, I don't believe, for a whole lot of reasons. I don't want to hijack the session by going into details there. And in fact, I'd love to talk to Melanie further about her experiences at some point. But all I wanted to say is there are other models. All of the concerns absolutely are things that need to be addressed, but there are other models that have been put in place overseas, and I guess we're certainly looking at one ourselves that achieve those outcomes without necessarily going for the fully centralised model. Yeah, so that was really the main comment I wanted to make. I'm sure there'll be a response.
Yes, sorry, I will make a response, which is just to say that I don't have the entirety of people involved in producing research software for Curtin either. What I've got is a subset that works across the university and different faculties. There are very large teams, particularly in astrophysics still, that are doing very focused and detailed domain-specific work towards, being able to leverage the huge data that's going to come from a square kilometre array, for example. And there's also a whole bunch of people in health science doing data linkages. So I fully agree with you that you can't actually centralise everybody into an organisation, and I wouldn't have been able to do that here either. So I think it's a question of at what level could you potentially do that, and would that provide value? But 100% also agree that there are other models.
Yeah, I mean, just without going into details, because we do have some quite large established groups, in a sense, using them to provide services in cases where the skills are fairly generic is the kind of model we're looking at. But even with something like that, you do need coordination, in a sense, across the institution to create this broader sense of community, and that's part of the model as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. Wyatt?
Dear friends, since I'm representing international network of women engineers and scientists, we have more than 64,000 members across the whole world. I believe we can work together. This is a very strong voices, but we all are all women, ladies, engineers, ladies scientists. I believe we can play a very significant role. I hope to see some follow-up actions that we can be a very important voices in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Wai. Thank you. So I'm just going to move on from this. This has been really interesting to hear about different institutions and different strategies and structures they've used to sort of employ RSEs and give researchers access to RSEs. When you think about research software at a policy level, what would you like to see implemented? What are some of the common challenges that you see with research software in your work? And what is a policy that you'd like to see implemented for the use of research software, for the use of software in research, sorry? Yes, Saranjeet.
I would say that making research software as open as possible, but also as closed as necessary. So implementing the open science principles to research software.
Sorry, why? Could you mute yourself, please? Thanks.
So yeah, so improving transparency and being able to have create reproducible software in research is something that I would hope that most of the research community adapts as soon as possible. But also I'm aware that not every software can be open, can be in the open space. So also respecting the closed space of software world. But whenever possible, having the open source principles applied would be would be really nice to have.
Yep, absolutely. Very critical to have an open software policy. Anyone else? Manodeep, unmuting.
I think for starters, I would like everyone to cite the software that they use, right? So that's one thing I would like. But what I really want is sort of a different category. I don't know if this falls under the credit models or what have you, but there's a difference between some software that was used. So for example, let's just say I used matplotlib, right? It's a Python code package to make plots. I used matplotlib and I made my paper. I made the plots in my paper with matplotlib. I should obviously be citing it. But if there was a software package without which I could not write the paper, basically, right, like in terms of if my paper would not have been possible without that piece of software, then I need to somehow signal that without this, I don't think such a model exists, right? Like usually we add them as authors, because if someone's an author, typically without them, the paper couldn't have been written in its present form, right? In the form that. So to me, the model that we currently have, which is use get cited. So if some software is so critical for a piece of work that the work couldn't have been done, then it needs sort of a special credit that this is, I mean, right, then that's sort of at the infrastructure level. If that piece of infrastructure wasn't there, you couldn't do your science, do your research. And currently, that's the one that's missing, right? A citation is a citation. So in my world, everyone knows about the software, everyone cites the software, which is not this world, but sometime we will get there. But that's one thing, one development. I actually haven't heard it ever being talked about. So I don't know if this is, but that's one thing I would like to see.
I wonder if you're thinking about a future world where AI is co-designing things and writing things with us, and then AI is an author of the paper. I don't know.
I mean, right, but
Yeah.
so, but to some extent, right? If you use ChatGPT to write your paper, like the first draft of your paper, right? Then ChatGPT was crucial to get your paper done, written. Typically, at least in astronomy, the person that writes the paper is the first author, typically, something. But if you use that, then citing ChatGPT is not sufficient, right? So that's sort of the aspirational goal that I hope to see, that I have, right?
Yeah. Anyone else want to give it a go?
Okay, basically, I'm keen to share that basically our voice, we always got a chance to approach the minister. At least we bring our voices to minister. I think this is a better approach to have the policy and strategy for RSE. You can, yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right. Yep, those sound really interesting. So citing software, can software or an AI be a co-author? Who knows, but that's an interesting point. And so I just want to close off with a last question. Since we sort of have a version of a strategy that that we think, you know, is good. We like it. The research software engineers of Australia and New Zealand, and we've sort of published it on Figshare. We've co-designed it with the community. We have a bunch of goals that we really want to be able to achieve. And how do we get to policy? I know we've touched on a few points of critical mass and making sure, you know, at the grassroots level, we're sort of raising awareness, we're talking to people, creating positive impact. What can we do to get to policy? Any advice or any next steps for us once we have a strategy in place?
My question is going to be, whose policy? Where do you want this policy to sit? Because as I said before, policy is created by individual organizations who have power to implement and enforce a set of standards. So at what level are you looking for policy?
Right. So I'm looking to see if we can reach institutional level. So like when you think about academic institutions, academic standards, I'm thinking at the government level where, you know, research software is an actual output of research. And we're thinking where does the government funding go? How is that impacted through policy? So I'm thinking more institutional and government.
So I think what you need to do here is, if you've come together as a peak body and said, we represent the research software engineers of Australia and New Zealand and more and beyond, here's a set of recommendations for best practice, is really what you want to do. So as I said before, with publications, the Vancouver Protocol was put out as a protocol. It was a recommendation, and then various institutions looked at that and adopted it and then put it into their policy to say, this is how we'll recognize authorship. I think that's where you're at here. You kind of want to sit there and say, make sure that people understand that research software is important and valuable and so forth, that people who work in this domain have this particular career space. It's not just adjunct to postdocs writing a bit of code, you know, on the weekend. It is a profession in and of itself. This is what it looks like. Here's a definition. Here are some examples, is what I would use, of where people have, or institutions have, put together career paths and structures. So someone just sent me a chat message who's listening, hi Claire, about CSIRO. So CSIRO apparently already has structured RSE pay scales and levels and responsibilities. We do now too. Bring those together and say, here are some examples, so that institutions that might not have this already can look at examples, because it's far easier to build on the work that somebody else has done, and build that awareness of this as a legitimate individual field and career, which is necessary for the ongoing productive function of research. That's my suggestion.
Sorry, one of the challenges I find is that I know like, for example, Melanie, you have at Curtin, there's a career pathways and all, and at CSIRO at Uni Melbourne with MDAP, there exists. But in my experience, those are all internal. Like, the documents are not available publicly, so I can't access, or someone can't access them. So it's harder to argue when you don't have the examples publicly available. But maybe that's something we can do when it's as an community. We can go, hey, can you share these documents, and then we can send it through.
And even if the documents themselves can't be shared, you could probably have a working group that sort of is able to access them, review them, and summarize them, because you don't really want the whole documentation. What you want is, you know, what do these different levels look like in terms of responsibility and pay grades and so forth, and do they roughly align? Or you could spend a lot of money. You could find someone to pay KPMG to do this, because KPMG do this all the time across various different organizations. You might not get the answer you want, but that's the sort of work you need to do.
Yeah, and I think it goes back into, we need to be funded to be able to do that work, to then make an impact in that way. But that's a really good point. Ideally,
I would always advocate that people don't work for free if you don't have to. So if you can find someone to, you know, fund this as an exercise, that would be definitely worth pursuing. You might have to do some work for free to start with, though, to demonstrate the value.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of our goals in the strategy is to sort of have an advisory committee of senior members that can sort of advise the steering committee, because we are all sort of not at the senior management level. And so I think that idea of having a working group or an advisory group somehow just giving us direction and ideas from institutions that have already implemented such models would be really good.
Yep, absolutely. Also, in addition to helping you, it improves the visibility and the gravitas of the work that's being done. So if you can demonstrate that you've got buy-in from senior people across the sector, that is extremely helpful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool, great advice. Anyone else? If not, yep.
I just wanted to point out that if we could build compelling cases based on stories of people who have been successful in these roles, or institutes who have been successful in these roles, and then use those to take forward or showcase to our institutes. It could be as simple as just sharing it to our department head or to our manager, our line manager. I think that would cause some shift in the culture. And also, I believe that moving from strategy to policy, it can be a very difficult path. So persisting on this path, believing in yourself that what you're doing is eventually going to be fruitful, and be prepared to adapt to the changes that are coming in would also be quite helpful. So persistence is the key in this case.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Why you have
Because
your
it
hand
can take a
So-
long time to
up?
just to make this change happen. So yes.
Yep. Changing culture is not easy.
Okay. Thanks for all the sharing. I think I will just use one word. It's the attitude. It's our practice. Take this as a norm, and I believe we can always bring the RSE culture, attitude, ethics, and considerations to another milestone.
Thank you, I. All right, and I think there were a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll look up. I have there was this one question from Pradeep who says, at medical research facilities, we routinely see a lot of investment in hardware, but not as much in software. Yep, we discussed that slightly. How do you communicate and emphasize the importance of investment in software development and RSEs? I think we touched upon this in various parts of our conversation, but does anyone have a quick one they want to summarize?
You need to engage clinicians is my biggest piece of advice there. So we do a lot of projects in the health sector, which is around helping clinicians make their work more efficient. If you, in the medical research sector, if you can't get that buy-in at the senior researchers or the clinicians, then it's very difficult to affect change. Having said that, there is a huge amount of work being done at the moment to unlock medical data to make it more standardized and more efficient. I was in a meeting yesterday where somebody told me that they were still using a piece of software written in 2005 to do data entry, and it's not much better than Excel. So talking to people about the efficiencies that they'll gain in engaging proper RSEs and having proper processes is the best way to buy in clinician support and unlock dollars to make it move.
All right, hope that helps, Pradeep. If there are any other last minute questions, feel free to populate it in the chat and we can ask the panelists.
Oh, sorry, I just saw Betsy's suggestion, RSE Wiki and something to collect good examples, and I think that's a great suggestion. We can just add that. We can add it on our RSE-AUNZ website. So I'm assuming this is regards to the career pathways or the scales and all that. But in general, sharing this sort of information would be fantastic for the community.
Yes, absolutely. And as we work to engage an advisory group or a committee, it would be really good to, be really open about those documentation so people can benefit. But I hope that's what you meant, Betsy. This was around the institutions and good examples.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, and I don't see any more questions in the chat. So with that, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists for indulging in my questions and for having such a great and invigorating conversation. I look forward to, I look forward to more conversations. And I think there's a quick break before there is a actionable insights session, and there's going to be a closing, and that'll be the end of the conference. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for staying engaged and all of your comments in the chat. We'll see you in a bit.